In the dark edge of the galaxy where stars grew thin and silence wrapped around drifting debris like a forgotten graveyard, a single human vessel moved slowly, its frame, old but strong, held together more by will than steel, the ship belonged to a man named Daniel, a scavenger by trade, not a soldier, not a hero, just someone who moved through ruins and dust looking for what others left behind. He had no crew, no companion, except the voice of his ship's tired systems and the echo of music he sometimes played to keep loneliness away. Daniel's journey that day was not special, at least it did not seem so. At first he had been tracking a wreck near a dying moon. A signal, faint and weak, called him like a whisper from the past. When he reached the orbit, he found it there, a massive prison ship, ancient in design and half torn apart by meteors and time. The markings on its hull were strange but beautiful, symbols that hinted at something once proud, now ruined. The ship looked like it had not been touched in hundreds of years, and yet inside one chamber, a power source still glowed steady and alive. He docked with caution, stepping into the remains of a corridor lit by flickering red lights. The air was thin but breathable. The halls were silent. Broken walls showed signs of struggle, as if those who had been here fought to escape. He moved slowly, careful not to trigger any defense systems, until he found a cryochamber room deep at the ship's center. The walls were lined with frozen cells, most of them dark and empty, their lights long gone. Only one remained lit, glowing a faint blue inside. It floated a woman, tall, powerful, covered in armor that seemed part of her skin. Her face was calm, but her body showed scars, deep and old, her arms crossed as if even in sleep she dared the world to challenge her. Daniel stared at her, unsure what to do. His mind raced. Should he leave her? Should he wake her? Who was she, and why was she the only one left alive in this place? He scanned her cell. The data feed called her a Class Alpha threat, not something the scavenger wanted to deal with. Her name flashed briefly in a language he barely translated: Leora, Queen of Varek's world's prisoner, of the Galactic Concord. She had been someone powerful, someone dangerous, but that was long ago. And now she was dying. The chamber was failing. He had to choose: leave or act. He acted. He bypassed the old locks, worked through ancient code, and with a hiss the chamber opened. Warm air rushed out as the cryo mist faded. She fell forward, but he caught her, her body heavy with armor and sleep. He carried her back to his ship later on the med bay table and began basic treatment. She was not human, but close enough the systems could help. She breathed slowly, her pulse weak but steady. When she woke, her eyes snapped open, gold and fierce. She sat up quickly but stumbled, weak. Daniel raised his hand, showing he meant no harm. She looked at him, confused. Her voice cracked when she spoke, a language old but translated through his systems. She asked who he was and why he had brought her here. He told her simply. He found her. He could not leave her to die. She asked if he worked for the Council or her enemies. He said no. He barely knew who she was. She did not believe him, not at first. In the days that followed she stayed silent, resting, but always watching. She refused food at first, then slowly accepted water and ration packs. Daniel fixed parts of his ship, ran system checks, and spoke often. Even if she did not reply, he told her about Earth, about how humans were not part of the larger galactic wars, how they stayed hidden, unnoticed by most, but learned quickly, adapted faster than anyone. He told her he was just a scavenger, not a warrior, not a king, not anyone important. But something in the way he moved, spoke, and cared began to chip away at her. Coldness. One night, when the stars outside looked like fireflies caught in a black sea, she stood beside him in the cockpit, watching the galaxy spin slowly around them. She asked him if he believed in fate. He said he did not. He believed in choices, not destinies. She said her people believed in blood and war, in loyalty and strength. But when they turned on her for choosing peace, she realized strength was not enough. And now here she was, not a queen, not a prisoner, just a relic drifting in a world that forgot her. Daniel looked at her then, not as a weapon, not as royalty, but as someone broken, trying to understand herself. Again he said maybe the galaxy forgot her, but he had not, and maybe that meant something. She did not answer, but for the first time, She smiled, not fully, not with joy, but with something close to hope. The ship moved on through forgotten routes, passing asteroids and dead satellites. Leora began to walk more, eat more, her strength returning. Quickly, her silence lessening, she asked more questions about Earth, about humans, about why Daniel would risk his life for a stranger. He said maybe he was just tired of watching everything fall apart. Maybe saving one person, even if she was once a queen, made the universe feel a little less empty. One day they received a signal, a warning. Someone had tracked them, likely scavenger hunters or mercenaries. They would arrive in hours. Daniel prepared to run, but the ship was slow. It would not outrun them. Not in time. He turned to Leora, asking what they should do. Her eyes flashed with fire for the first time since her release. She stood tall, like a warrior. Again, she said they would not run, not today. She would show him what a queen of Virex truly was, and in that moment, Daniel saw her not as a relic, not as a burden, but as someone reborn. The warrior queen was waking, not through power or vengeance, but through kindness, through choice, through the simple courage of one human who refused to walk away from someone a galaxy had forgotten. The stars watched as the ship turned slowly toward the oncoming threat, not to escape, but to face it together. Enemy ships came fast like steel hounds with engines that howled across the void, their weapons already charged, and their intentions clear. They did not come to talk, they came to destroy. Daniel sat in the pilot seat, hands steady, eyes sharp. The ship was not built for war, and he knew it could not last in a fight, but he did not flinch. He looked over at Leora, who stood behind him, her gaze fixed on the screen that showed their pursuers. Her armor now repaired, her body strong again, but her mind still sharpening itself for the battle to come. She moved to the control panel, her fingers quick as she rerouted power from dormant systems and began unlocking hidden functions of the ship systems Daniel had never touched. She was calm, completely calm, as if the storm behind them was nothing more than wind in an empty canyon. Daniel asked if she had done this before, and she simply nodded once and said too many times. They waited until the enemy ships were close, then she gave the word, and Daniel turned the ship into a narrow asteroid field, dodging through spinning rocks, while Leora operated the rear defense turrets, her shots precise, her judgment perfect. She did not waste energy, she did not miss. They clipped one of the smaller ships, sent it spinning into a rock, and the rest broke formation, trying to follow but unable to keep up through the tight space. Daniel was breathing hard, sweat on his forehead, but Leora looked almost peaceful, her heart steady, her mind sharper than ever. When they finally lost the last pursuer, she stepped back from the panel and looked at Daniel for a long moment. Before telling him that he had done well, he laughed softly and said maybe he was learning a thing or two from her. They found a small port station on a quiet moon, with no loyalty to any major power. It was a place for smugglers, drifters, and exiles, the kind of place where credit spoke louder than laws. Daniel brought the ship in and paid for repairs while Leora stayed cloaked beneath a dark hood, her face hidden but her posture impossible to ignore. People stared. Some recognized the shape of her armor, but no one dared speak aloud. Daniel walked through the market gathering supplies while Leora moved like a shadow. She was drawn to an old cum tower, broken and rusted, but still partially active. She stood near it and whispered a string of numbers and names into its console, ancient codes from a life she once ruled. Then she walked away, saying nothing but knowing her message had gone out somewhere. Someone had heard it. Later that night, in the quiet hold of the ship, Daniel asked her what she said. She replied that she called out to ghosts, her old commanders, her scattered followers, those who might still believe in her, those who might still be alive. He asked if she thought they would come. She said she did not know, but if even one answered, it would be enough. The next day brought trouble again. A group of bounty hunters boarded the station looking for high-value targets, and one of them caught a glimpse of Leora's face. A single moment, a flash of recognition, and everything changed. They tried to follow her, but she moved faster, her blade silent and lethal. She did not kill unless she had to, but when she had to, there was no hesitation. Daniel found her later standing over two unconscious bodies. Her breath calm, her hands clean. She said they would not talk again, and they had to leave soon. Back on the ship, Daniel asked her if she regretted anything she had done before her capture. She did not answer immediately. She looked out at the stars for a long time, then said she regretted waiting too long to choose peace, that by the time she saw the truth, the war machine she had built was already beyond her control, and when she tried to stop it, they branded her a traitor and locked her away. She said power was a storm, easy to summon, but hard to contain, and she paid the price for believing she could shape it alone. Daniel listened quietly, then told her that maybe she was meant to find someone else to shape it with this time. Someone who did not care about crowns or thrones, but only about doing what was right. She looked at him then. Not as a soldier, not as a queen, but as something more, something softer, not weaker, but real and grounded. And maybe for the first time, she felt like she was not alone. The ship left the port behind, slipping into the stars. Once more days passed as they traveled through quiet systems and abandoned outposts, and then one day, a signal arrived, a voice faint and rough, but familiar. It was a commander from her past, someone who had vanished after the war. He had received her message, and he was not the only one. Small groups had begun to whisper her name again, to remember who she was and what she stood for. Before the fall, they arranged a meeting on a neutral world, half buried in sand and old ruins. Daniel and Leora landed quietly and waited. At the edge of a broken city where glass towers once touched the sky, now cracked and hollow, but still holding echoes of light. One by one, ships began to arrive, none grand, none dangerous, just worn vessels filled with old warriors and survivors who had nothing left but memory and hope. They came, not because they believed in power, but because they believed in her. Leora stood before them and spoke not like a queen, but like a leader who had bled, who had lost, who had been betrayed, and still rose again. She told them she did not seek a throne. She did not seek revenge. She sought only justice and freedom, and if they followed her again, it would not be for glory, but for the right to choose their path and live free. They listened in silence. Then one by one they stepped forward, pledging not to a crown, but to a cause. Daniel watched it all from the edge of the crowd, unsure of where he fit in, until one of the old warriors turned to him and said, "Without you, she would not be here. You gave her back to us." He nodded, not needing more. As the new alliance began to form, ships being refitted, plans being drawn, whispers turning to voices, Daniel realized the galaxy was shifting, and at the center of it stood the human who dared to free a queen, not for power, not for gain, but because it was the right thing to do. And beside him stood the warrior who once ruled worlds, now ready to rise again, with fire in her heart and a new kind of strength in her soul. The desert winds moved softly across the old stones where the city once breathed with pride. Now silence held the sky, and memories floated like dust between broken towers and rusted steel. Daniel stood near the edge of the gathering, watching the faces of those who had come. Most were scarred and aged by time, their eyes filled with shadows of wars long past. They did not cheer. They did not chant. They simply stood quiet and ready, like soldiers who had lost much and still chose to stand again, because something deeper than orders called them. Now Leora moved among them, her steps firm, her words careful. She spoke not like a queen returning to claim a throne, but like a leader asking for trust. Her presence was enough to stir something ancient inside them. The way she carried herself, the way her voice cut through the dry air, reminded them of who she had once been, before betrayal, before the silence, before the chains that tried to erase her name. Daniel watched her with quiet awe. Never had he seen someone who could command without shouting, lead without force. He knew she was strong, knew she had power that could break walls, but it was her restraint, her grace in the face of uncertainty, that drew others to her. He kept his place in the background, helping where he could, fixing systems, running scans, gathering supplies, while Leora did what only she could do, speak to those who still believed, even if they had forgotten. They did. Over the next few days, more ships came, small vessels from the outer rings, hidden colonies and deep stations, rebels, deserters, and even traitors, all carrying stories, all remembering the queen who once chose peace. When all others chose war, many asked why she had returned. Why now? Why bring back a name that once triggered fear and hope in equal measure? Leora answered the same way each time. She said she did not return to conquer. She returned to finish what she started, to build a future, not ruled by fear or silence. One night as stars burned quiet above, Daniel sat alone near the ship cleaning old gear when one of the commanders approached. A man named Torin, with eyes that had seen too many losses. He asked Daniel what he was in all this. Not a fighter, not a noble, not even from their world. Daniel replied simply that he was someone who saw a dying fire and chose to feed it instead of walking away. Torin studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if something important had been confirmed. Without another word he walked away, leaving Daniel with thoughts heavier than any weapon. Leora found him later standing near the ridge where the city fell into darkness. She stood beside him and said nothing for a while, then told him the fleet was growing, not fast but steady, and each new ship brought more eyes and more risk. Daniel asked if she was afraid. She said she was always afraid, but fear could not stop what had begun. They spoke then about Earth, about small things like trees and music and rain. Leora listened carefully, her mind curious, her heart slowly remembering what peace might feel like. The next day brought word from a spy network still loyal to Leora. Hidden deep within the central systems, they had discovered plans of a new weapon being prepared by the ruling regime, a device meant to erase entire regions from orbit, clean, fast, and silent. No rebellion could survive such force. Leora called her commanders together. They needed more than ships, they needed information. They needed allies in places where silence ruled. Daniel volunteered to go on one of the missions, a deep infiltration into a neutral world where data on the weapon was kept. Leora hesitated, told him it was dangerous, that he did not owe her anything. He replied that he owed himself the chance to be more than a witness. He wanted to help, truly help, and she saw in his eyes that same fire that had drawn her in from the start, not of a warrior, but of someone who chose light even in the dark. He left with a small team traveling in a disguised freighter, slipping through old trade routes until they reached the data vault planet, clean and cold, with skies that never changed. Daniel played his role well, acting like a traitor lost in red tape while the others moved through shadows, gathering files, stealing passwords, tracing signals, and at the heart of the vault, they found what they needed: blueprints, reports, and worst of all, a list of targets, colonies, planets, even moons that held voices of resistance marked for silent erasure. They left quickly, unnoticed by most but not by all. As they returned to their ship, they were ambushed guards who had caught a scent of wrongness, too late to stop them fully but early enough to draw blood. Daniel fought not with skill but with desperation. He was struck but kept moving, dragged one of his teammates to safety, fired blindly to hold back the attackers, and somehow they made it out, flying through low orbit, chased by alarms and laser fire, until the stars swallowed them again. Back at the hidden base, Leora met them as they landed. Daniel stepped out, wounded but alive, holding the stolen data drive in his hand. She took it without a word, but her eyes spoke what her lips did not. She helped him to the med bay, sat beside him while the systems healed his wounds. She did not speak of war or duty that night, only asked if he was in pain, and listened when he said he was, but not from the wounds, not truly. The pain was from knowing how much would be lost. If they failed, the data revealed everything, the scale, the power. The planet was worse than they feared, and now there was no choice but to act. Leora knew the time for waiting had ended. The quiet had passed. What stood before them now was a storm, and they would meet it not as ghosts of a fallen age, but as voices of a new one. Daniel stood beside her when she called the fleet together, his arm in a sling, his voice calm as he spoke to them, told them what they had seen, what they had learned, what they had risked to bring the truth back. The response was clear: the fleet would rise, and not just to survive, but to fight for something real, for freedom, for choice, for the right to live without fear. And in the eyes of those gathered, Daniel saw something he had not seen before, not just belief in Leora but belief in what she stood for, in what they could become together, and though he was just one human among many, his voice had sparked something that now burned across the stars. Brighter than any sun, the fleet began to move, not with noise, not with fire, but with quiet purpose, each ship guided by an unspoken oath, each pilot carrying more than just fuel and steel. They carried hope and pain and memories of what was lost and what could still be saved. Leora stood at the center of it. All her voice steady, her orders clear, her presence alone enough to shape the course of minds. Grown cold from exile, she moved through the halls of her flagship, not with pride, but with focus, and those who saw her felt something shift inside themselves. Like dust blown away by the return of a strong wind, Daniel walked beside her, not as a shadow, not as a follower, but as someone who had earned a place by action, by truth, by standing firm when it would have been easier to turn away. He still carried wounds from the last mission, but he never complained, never stepped back, and when others questioned why a human stood so close to a queen, Leora answered only that without him none of this would have begun, and without him it would not be finished either. Stolen data had revealed not just targets but timelines. The weapon was nearly complete, stationed in a high-orbit lab above the capital world, guarded by layers of defense and silence. The ruling council believed themselves untouchable, hidden behind alliances and fear, but now fear was slipping from their grip because the whispers had grown into voices, and the voices into plans, and the plans into movement. And now the movement stood ready to rise. Leora held council with her commanders, their faces marked by different planets, different paths, but joined now by purpose. They argued and debated. Some wanted to strike fast and hard, others wanted to delay, build more strength. Daniel spoke softly, but his words found weight. He said fear feeds on delay, and that waiting too long would only cost more lives. He said the people in the path of the weapon did not have time, they needed action, and they needed it now. The decision was made. They would divide their strength. One half would attack the capital, directly drawing the fleet and the focus of the regime, while the other half, led by Leora, would strike the lab, destroy the weapon, and cut the hand before it could close. Daniel asked to be with her. She did not question it. She only told him to be ready, and he said he already was. The ships launched under the dark of a quiet star there, engines humming like breath in deep sleep. They moved through forgotten channels, old warpaths covered by debris fields and radio silence. Daniel sat in the crew bay checking gear, while Leora stared at the map of the station, each route, each weakness etched into her mind like lines of fate waiting to be broken. She spoke little before battle, but her presence was stronger than any speech. As they neared the target, defenses awoke, turrets spun, and drones emerged like metal insects, but Leora was already moving. Orders, sharp shields, raised angles, shifted. The fleet curved and twisted like a bird through fire, drawing the enemy into confusion, then breaking through just long enough for the assault team to reach the station hull. Daniel followed her through the breech suit, sealed weapon drawn, heart steady, not as a soldier, but as someone who believed. Inside, the station lights flickered, alarms screamed, air shook with the sound of chaos. Leora led the way, her blade drawn in one hand, her other guiding the team forward. Every turn brought resistance guards in heavy gear, drones with cold eyes, but none could stop her. She moved with fury and purpose. Every step a strike against the weight of years stolen from her, every breath a claim to a future not yet written. Daniel fought at her side, not with elegance, but with determination, using cover, using instinct, surviving because he refused to fall. They reached the core, where the weapon pulsed with quiet death, a machine built to end worlds. With silence, its heart guarded by a commander from Leora's past, someone who once swore loyalty, then helped bind her in chains. His voice was calm but hollow as he offered surrender. If she walked away again, if she chose silence once more. Leora did not stop, did not speak. She moved forward, blade raised, and with no rage, only truth. She defeated him not with cruelty, but with clarity. Then disabled the weapon with her own hands, tearing apart the control systems until the light faded. And the silence that followed was not death, But relief outside the station, the enemy began to retreat. News had spread faster than expected. The capital fleet faltered, morale cracked, commanders questioned orders, and citizens on the ground began to rise, not in riot, but in refusal. They turned off comms, ignored summons, refused to obey what they no longer believed in. The regime did not fall with explosions, it fell with the slow unraveling of loyalty that no longer had a face worth following. Leora stood on the station deck, staring out at the ships that now began to circle, not in combat, but in honor and respect. Daniel stood beside her, bruised, tired, but alive. He asked her what came next. She said, not war, not rule, not power, but rebuilding. Not with flags, but with choices, with new voices, with people who knew what it meant to lose and still choose to rise again. They returned to the hidden city, now alive with motion, engineers building medics, healing children, laughing between broken walls that now stood as markers of where darkness once lived and where light had begun. Again Leora walked among them, not above them, not apart. She spoke to each person as if they mattered, because they did, and when she passed they did not bow. They stood tall because she had given them reason to. Daniel found himself near the old ridge again, where wind carried dust like memories. He looked up at the stars, thought of Earth, thought of what one choice had become, how one act of mercy had sparked fire in a frozen soul, and how that fire had spread not in destruction, but in warmth. Leora joined him later. They said little, just stood together, watching the galaxy shift around them, no longer strangers, no longer bound by what had been, but joined by what they had chosen to become together. And though the final step still waited, they both knew the storm had passed, and the dawn had begun to rise. Capital World stood under a sky that once held fear, now filled with ships carrying banners of a new dawn. The streets no longer echoed with orders shouted from towers, but with voices of the people speaking freely, sharing new songs and stories of change. The silence that once pressed over the cities like a weight had been lifted, and in its place there was breath, there was movement, and there was hope. Daniel walked through those streets unnoticed by most, but not unseen, his clothes simple, his eyes sharp, taking in everything, not as a conqueror, not as a guest, but as someone who had played his part and now wanted only to see what his part had built. Leora moved ahead of him, surrounded by those who had once knelt, now walking beside her. Commanders, diplomats, healers, traders. They followed her not because of what she had been, but because of what she had become. No throne, no crown, only a voice that spoke when it mattered and stayed silent when it did not. Her return to the capital was not a march, it was a homecoming of someone who had left not by choice and returned not for glory, but because her people still needed someone to stand where others had fallen. Inside the main hall, where the old regime once ruled from high chairs behind guarded glass, Leora stood in front of the crowd, their faces filled with questions. Not of her power, but of what she would choose. Now she looked at them not with command, but with calm, and told them she would not sit where fear once lived. She would not rule from a distance or speak through walls. She would walk the streets, live among the people, and listen more than she spoke, because no world could stand again if its leaders floated above the ground where real lives were lived. Some did not believe her, some expected her to take full control, expected a return to the old way, wrapped in a new name. But when weeks passed and she kept her promise, walking without guards, eating in public, sitting with workers, and listening to those whose names no one ever asked before, even the doubters began to shift. Their eyes opened and saw that this was not a trick, it was a choice repeated every day in small ways and slow moments. And those small things became the foundation of something no regime could break. Daniel stayed close, never in the center, never asking for credit. But his presence was known among those who remembered how it began. They called him the spark, the voice, the hand that reached into the past and pulled out a future. Leora often smiled when she heard this, not because it was wrong, but because it was more true than most could guess. Without Daniel, there would be no ships, no freedom, no rising, and even though he never claimed that truth, it followed him like a quiet shadow that never needed to speak to be seen. One evening, as the city lights blinked softly, and the stars above turned slowly in their endless arc. Leora and Daniel stood on the high platform where once only rulers had stood, now open to all below them. Music rose from the streets, laughter climbed the walls, voices old and young mixed together, not in perfect harmony, but in honest noise, the sound of a world breathing again. Daniel asked her what came next, not for her, but for them, for the people, and she told him it would be hard, that peace was not the end of struggle, only the beginning of a different kind, where the enemies were doubt and greed, and the battles were fought with patience and truth and courage. That did not carry blades. He nodded, knowing she was right, knowing that freedom was not given once and kept forever, but had to be guarded every day, not by guns, but by the will to protect what made it matter. He told her he might return to Earth one day, not soon, but someday, and she said he should, and when he did, he should tell him what he saw, how one person with no army, no power, had changed the path of stars by choosing to act when he could have turned away. She stepped down from the platform, then walking into the streets without ceremony. Daniel followed her, not as a shadow, but as a friend. And those who saw them did not cheer or shout. They smiled, they stepped aside, not with fear, but with quiet respect, because they knew these were not gods or rulers, but people who had suffered, who had lost, and still chosen to give back more than. They took the galaxy beyond, began to shift alliances, faded new ones, formed old wars, cooled traitors, returned to roots once closed. Messages carried stories of what had happened, of how a queen was freed, and a human stood beside her. And together, they broke a machine built on silence, and shaped something that could grow in its place. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And every time that story was told, someone, somewhere stood a little taller, spoke a little louder, dreamed a little bigger. Years passed, not in shadows, but in light. The station where the weapon once floated was turned into a place of learning, a library, a sanctuary, a reminder that even things built for destruction could be rebuilt for knowledge. The fleet once formed for war now protected the weak, delivered aid, guarded peace instead of power, and at the heart of all these changes the story remained. Not as a myth, but as a memory shared by those who lived it, and those who believed in what it meant. Leora never returned to the throne. Instead, she built something without walls, a council of voices from every world, every walk, and she listened first before speaking, and when she did, people listened, not out of fear, but trust. And Daniel never stood at the front, never asked for more than a quiet place to work, to teach, to explore. Sometimes in old halls, sometimes on ships, and sometimes under quiet stars where he could think without noise. But sometimes late at night, when the sky was clear and the city lights softened just enough, you would meet her again on the platform. They would stand in silence watching the stars, and neither would need to speak, because everything had already been said in every act they had taken together, and in that silence there was peace, not of endings, but of understanding. And so the galaxy turned, still wild, still vast, still full of questions, but no longer ruled by silence or fear, and all because one human freed a warrior queen, not to control her, not to change her, but to let her choose again, and in doing so changed more than her destiny. He changed the course of stars, the rhythm of voices, and the shape of what tomorrow could become. The end.